Well, when the earthquake started, I didn't even realize it was an earthquake because my father and brother and I were in the car and we were just leaving my grandmother's at Palmer. We're near Palmer. We were going to go downtown and do a little bit of shopping. And my uncle's car was parked right beside ours, and it just looked like our car had started rolling. At least that's what it looked like to start with. And then I realized that it was something a little different, because first our car would be ahead and then it'd be behind. It was just like there were two cars were racing, you know. It looked kind of strange. And it took a few minutes before it really dawned on me that it was an earthquake and it wasn't just something else going wrong. And then I heard a little dog sort of scream. It wasn't a bark, but he was scared. He was a little puppy, and I found out later that he'd gotten so scared he ran to my cousin, and she had to hold him in order to quiet him. And he was just all upset over it. And my uncle's cows, he has about 60 cows. He has a dairy farm, and they were in milking cows at the time, and the cows got upset, naturally, to say the least. They couldn't stand on the milking platforms, and then they turned and they ran and they jumped the rails on the fence in the barn, and they got out, and my uncle said it'll probably be 3 or 4 hours of constant herding them before he could get them back in, so he just forgot about them, left them run that night, and they were inside the main fences anyway. And it didn't cause any real damage up there. It's just a lot of shattered nerves, and then the radio didn't help matters any, saying that Anchorage was all in the shambles. And then the power was out. We didn't have any electricity at all for the dairy farms until they got a generator up there and got it going on the farm about noon Saturday. So.
Not only did I experience the quake as you all did, but I think I learned some things. From the experiences that others had had and told me about, I feel that the waves were coming generally south to north. This may have been the way you experienced it. I know a car on a Seward Highway was rocking like this, and the car on Northern Lights Boulevard, which runs east and west, was rocking in this direction. So the waves were probably going south to north. I also learned that you never can depend on reports that somebody makes when they're excited at a time like this. Even radio announcers. Because people this one woman in Oklahoma City heard that the town, hundreds were dead and the town was leveled and it was on fire. She came up here, she had children up here, and she came up here as fast as she was on vacation, and she came up here as fast as she could. But it wouldn't have done much good if it was all destroyed anyway, but she did. And found that it was completely false, and only very, very few people had been killed, although that is a tragedy too. Then I also learned that what states of shock what shock this can create in people. I saw the expressions on people's faces coming away from their homes just after they'd sank in, or their relatives had been swallowed up in the earth, and they were a blank shock stare. Then this one girl whom I know, we'd been skiing, and after she was going over to her house, and was told that her house had gone into the inlet, which it hadn't. Shows you again, you can't depend on people's reports when they're excited. But she was in such a state of shock that she didn't even realize later, having seen her parents. Her parents spoke to her for a long while later, but she did not even remember having seen them, and thought that they'd drowned in the inlet until she finally saw them again after she was over her shock.
Well, as many Anchorage families were doing, we sat down to our dinner table and commenced to have our evening meal. And at first we thought, like any other little tremor, that this was just one of the average Alaskan things that we have to go through every now and then. And then I looked up in my mother's china cabinet and noticed that all the dishes were starting to come out, and my main concern was, oh, our lovely dishes, we can't let them break. And I jumped up and started pushing them all back, and my father said, out of the house, out of the house. So we went out into our backyard. I was barefooted. Father made me stand in the snow. And we really didn't realize what was happening. We were just amazed. We looked in wonder and saw the light poles swinging back and forth, and we have a view of the mental hospital from our backyard, and we could see the mental hospital just going like this, and we could look at it so abstractly and just, well, isn't that interesting, you know? It's just swinging back and forth. There was no panic, it was just wonderment. And after the quake was over, we went in and surveyed the damage in our home, and it was quite minimum. A few plants had fallen off the windowsills, and the dishes, of course, were kind of shattered, and all our glasses. And my mother was quite concerned over her offices in the downtown area. So not realizing the extent of the damage in Anchorage, she and my father got in our car and went downtown. Well, luckily, her building, the 4th Avenue building, was one of the few that was remaining standing. It's a quite old building and all wood, so only goes to show you some of these new modern buildings just aren't what they are made out to be. But her office, there was quite a bit of damage. All her machinery was ruined. She has hundreds and millions of these small filing plates that were covered all over the floor, all in alphabetical order at one time, all now to be put back in alphabetical order, which will take just months.
Thank you.
At the time of that quake, last Friday, or a week ago last Friday, I was out in Pierce Subdivision out on Campbell Station Road. And 3 of us were doing our accounting at the time and had just finished up on our adjusted trial balance and decided to take a coffee break. Well, one of the kids, Bonnie, she went into the living room to sit down and relax, and Jerry and I were sitting at the table there, just thought it was another tremor coming. Well, the house started shaking then quite fiercely, and it was one of these nice big A-frame houses, and we didn't give it too much thought. It was just another tremor, and we weren't too worried about it. And then when we went up into the kitchen to see what was going on, when we heard all this racket, we got up in there, and all the cupboards were swinging out. Every cupboard in the kitchen would swing out. All the dishes would come flying out. The refrigerator opened up. Everything was on the floor. Then all the cupboards would close again, and everything would be in there. Then all of a sudden they'd open up again, and everything was back out on the deck. So I thought this was really funny at the time. So to me, it really wasn't too big a disaster at the time. It was more humorous than anything. So we were standing in this archway then, a real strongly braced archway, and we knew we were pretty safe there, except that they had this big chandelier hanging from the this entryway, and the chandelier was swinging from beam to beam, and it was about 3 feet long. It was swinging from beam to beam. About that time, we decided we better get out of the house. So we went outdoors right then, and the cars, there's no poles out there or anything else that you can see, and the houses were all relatively still, but the cars were all bouncing up and down and back and forth, and Bonnie was hanging on to the car, and I was hanging on to Bonnie, and Jerry was hanging on to me. Finally, the quake stopped, and I still didn't think that there was much damage in town. I figured it was just nuisance value damage. All the chimneys were down out in that area. Jerry's chimney had fallen over and crushed his truck, but I still was impervious to how much damage had been done. And so I drove Bonnie home then, and the roads were all cracked, but that still didn't impress me as being much damage. I guess maybe if I'd been in Turnagain, I'd have thought otherwise.
Well, I think compared to the experiences other people have had in this town that I heard, that mine was relatively minor. It didn't seem important at all, but my husband and I live in Connect Arms, and we live on the first floor, and at the time the tremor hit, I thought it was the furnace blowing up, so I took off out of the apartment. When I got to the front door, there was another lady there hanging on for dear life, and we just hung on together because about this time we could realize that the conditions outside were certainly not any better than the ones inside. So we just hung on to these doors and were thrown back and forth until it was over. So then I had locked myself out of my apartment and running out. So I got the man to let me back in, and I still didn't realize that anything was, there was any considerable damage. So then by this time I was kind of nervous, and I decided I better get outside and walk around. And at this time I realized all the faults. I walked out, and some of the newer buildings, the people had built around town were in these 30-foot faults, and So then I did get worried about my husband, so I took off to the central building. It was one of the few buildings, like again an old building, came through with hardly any cracks in it at all. But I think after finding everybody was okay, kind of calmed down a little bit. I think one of my main experience in this has been, my husband and I were in close contact with the governor's office the whole time that they were down here before they went to Washington, D.C. And we heard some of the real stories of heroism behind the scenes, and it was really impressive. I think one of the biggest things was military. We were talking to the Attorney General, and he said that the military were the only people that remained calm, that even seemed to know where to begin to pick up the pieces and to start somewhere. So I thought this was a real tribute to them.
Well, I was one of the lucky ones, of course. There are many of us. I'm very fortunate to be one of the lucky ones. To not have experienced such a frightening, well, it was frightening. It scared the curl right out of my hair. But my roommate and I were in our room in the dorm at the time, and of course the earthquake started, and I just thought it was going to be another nice earthquake. I had experienced one in the past summer, and it was fun. But then we realized it wasn't quite as slight as the others had been, and so our first reaction, mine, was to get away from the glass from the window. So I noticed Ariane was already on the floor. So we both got down on the floor and started edging under the beds. They still can't understand how I got under, because I think the beds are about 7 inches off the floor. But we told them, you'll do anything to get away from an earthquake. But it's odd what goes through your mind at a time like this. And what went through my mind, the first thing I did was grab the lamp, put it down on the bed, and unplug the iron and put it on the floor. And then all the time the earthquake was in motion, or we were in motion. I kept worrying about an antique jewelry box that I have. It's a letter box, actually. That's all I could think of. That darn letter box. Arian's holding my hand, comforting me. But we were very fortunate, of course, to have been in the dorm. But after it was all over, we got up, of course. Arian went out, see if any damage had been done, or see what was going on. And everyone in the whole building was out. There wasn't anybody in the building. Arian and I stayed in our room. Stayed right in our room. But we didn't realize quite how bad it was, because that immediately I was dressed and was gone home to have dinner. We didn't have any idea to what extent the damage had been.
Well, I just got through working in this chemistry lab. I went over to the building, to the dorm, to see Amos and Ben. Then we were contemplating on what we would eat that evening when the earthquake struck. Well, I didn't realize what was happening, because that was my first experience. But I could see Amos running out of the dorm. Then I had to follow him. Then Ben followed. Went out, and I could see the building going back and forth, and the cars dancing outside. And then I saw the girls on the other side dancing too. I said, boy, this thing was going to be terrible. Then all of a sudden it stopped, but I was all the time laughing. And Ben joined me, because that was our first experience. Well, it stopped and everything was dark. The radio stations were shut off. And boy, I didn't realize the effect until when I went downtown Sunday to see the damages. Then I got a telegram from my brother in Scotland. He has had an experience before back at home, just a year before I was born. And he was telling me that when he struck, he was playing soccer. Then I realized, oh boy, I was happy. I was lucky not to have been on the field playing soccer this time. Then I have to tell him all the experience I've gone through. And then I realized this one wasn't serious as the Columbus Day storm in Oregon. But all the same, I don't expect anything to happen again, and I wish it won't. Thank you.
a kid, I was on PNA, headed for Homer from Kodiak, going back from vacation, and we didn't know what was going on. The pilot said it had been a quake in Anchorage and they'd lost all contact except with Kodiak, so we didn't know whether the world was still down here or not, and they wouldn't tell us anything. So we got back to Kodiak, and they said there was no damage. So, and they wouldn't let us go into town for 2 hours. So finally this other guy and I took off and walked up the hill and walked down to town. And by then the first tidal wave had hit, and the whole main street, well, about 2/3 of the main street on the first one was about a block back of where it used to be. And there were power scows and everything set up in Main Street. And what used to be the street was now just a beach. And the city docks, all the canneries, Kodiak Airways and everything was completely disappeared. So Kodiak was just about gone, the fishing fleet was just about gone, and then they had a couple more tidal waves, but they were all smaller and didn't affect him too much. But most of the housing district is up in the Aleutian Homes, and they're up on high ground, so they didn't have any trouble. And within 2 days we had heat and lights and everything, but still a little bit short on food and everything.
Well, at the time I was at Hillberg ski slope, and we had just come down the mountain, and this friend and I were sitting inside the lodge having a Coke. And inside the lodge they have these fluorescent lights all along the top of the ceiling, and this started shaking and shaking, and my Coke fell off the table, and I stood there and just looked, and I didn't know what to do. I just didn't think anything of it. But this guy I was with, he looked up, and down at the end of the building, the last fluorescent lamp started to fall, and the next one fell, and the next one fell. By that time, he was going out the door, but the door wouldn't open. It was the exit. We were at the other end, and I got out of the table, off the table there, where I was sitting, because it was just going like this, and the girl behind the counter didn't know what to do. She was petrified. So I just took a flying leap and knocked the door open, and we stood out on the bottom of the hill, and the bottom of our feet, the ground just split right between our feet, and by this time we get kind of worried because the telephone poles are going like this, and everybody standing on skis with the poles look like they were on pogo sticks, because it was really hilarious. The first thing I did, I looked up in the air looking for a mushroom cloud, because I didn't know what was going on, but it didn't really bother me at the time. I just said, well, little earthquake. So we grabbed our skis and jumped into the car, and from Elmendorf we got down on Government Hill, and traffic was bumper to bumper. And this guy coming from town stopped by the car in front of us, and he told the guy, he said that 4th Avenue was gone, and I thought it was a big joke. But this was right after it happened, not even 4 or 5 minutes, and we drove up into town there by C Street, and you just couldn't believe what C Street looked like right after this happened. It was about 30 feet high, and it just crevassed straight down. We parked the car and went up behind the Hofbräu and down by Kozlowski's men's store, and it was just, oh, you just can't believe the way it looked. In the parking lot behind the Hofbräu, 3/4 of that was down about 50 feet, I guess, something like that, and cars were down there. And this woman was running around, and she was in hysterics because her husband was inside the building next to Hofbräu, and this building had dropped off quite a bit. So this other guy and I found a rope, and we went inside the building and got the man who was pinned underneath a big cabinet of some kind, and we pulled him out, and then the civil defense came around, and they were mad because we were down in there trying to get this guy out. Well, that kind of really burned us, but we didn't think anything of it, so we drove over towards L Street and saw the damage there out to Turnagain. And by this time, we came back into town, and if you were down on Romig Hill, I don't know about that big, you saw a big crack down there, but I was directing traffic down there for 4 hours. And I finally wised up and took off. I said, the heck with this. So I went out to, finally got to my house. Well, this is my friend's house, and his dad wanted him to stay with his mother and his father, so he gave me his car, and I went home and I saw my parents, and they were sitting down eating, and my mother was really worried, but we didn't, ever since this happened, we just hooked up our generator, and we've had heat, water, and lights ever since this happened.
In 1954, there was a quake in the middle of the night, and I thought at that time, well, that's the worst one I ever want to go through. Of course, like a lot of you, I've been in Alaska quite a few years, so earthquakes aren't
These small ones aren't too uncommon. But I was at home in my apartment off from International Airport Road, and two of my children, my oldest two, were outside playing out back, and my other boy was in the bedroom asleep on my bed, and I had my boyfriend's little boy was there playing in the living room, and I was fixing dinner. And the minute it started, the little Mike asked me what was going on, and I said, oh, it's just a little earthquake. And about that time, things really began to shake, and I was holding on to him, and then all of a sudden we were both on the floor, and things were flying out of the cupboards. But the only thing I could think of was the natural gas, and I thought, well, what if the pipes break and there's an explosion or something? And that really concerned me more than the earthquake itself. But I didn't know how to navigate to get in to get my little boy in the bedroom, and I just sat there and watched everything going around, and I watched my lamps fall off the tables, and it just seemed like there was nothing I could do. But actually we didn't get outside until after things had pretty well settled down, and even then the earth was still going up and down, and the car rocking back and forth, and the two children outside were didn't know quite what was going on either. But we survived very well. We didn't have any heat or anything for about 3 days, but we all got back to normal. But when you have children like that, and you don't think so much about yourself, you're thinking about them, and you really don't have time sometimes to be scared, because there's just too many things going through your mind. It's only afterwards sometimes that you have the reaction. I know after this last little shock we had the other day, everybody was so spooky by that time that they really panicked, I think, more than they did during the first earthquake.
Well, about all I can say is ditto to John. He about told the story as far as my house went. I'd like to relate what my father thought. He was on a jet to Anchorage. He was about an hour out of Anchorage when they got the report of the earthquake. So they had to turn around and go back to Seattle. You can imagine what the people on the plane thought when they heard that Anchorage was leveled and it was in really bad shape, and then they wouldn't say anything. That's all they'd say, and well, that's all they had, really. And he got back to Seattle and had to wait with no report of how anybody was in Anchorage. He said it seemed like an eternity. And he and a few other people that were on this plane were running around Seattle trying to charter an airplane or buy one or something just to get back to Anchorage to see what was going on. And he brought back a few papers from Seattle, and they were big red headlines, 600 dead, and people are searching around in the rubble for survivors, and this Anchorage is a sea of flames, and he said there was more panic down there than there was up here, after he got back up and found out the situation. He said there was just, people seemed like it had happened there instead of here, and everybody was crying and carrying on like it would do any good at all. And so when he got back, my mom and I were sure glad. Because I don't know, if you kind of feel lost and helpless when you can't do anything in something like that, and there's nowhere to go or no way to get in touch with anybody down in the States and let them know you're all right.
I was down here at the University branch bank in the corner, and the first tremor didn't bother me a bit because I experienced them up here, and the first few seconds of that first tremor, because I experienced them here and some fairly strong ones in California. But when I saw the walls creak on that building and the ceiling bounce up and down, I knew it wasn't just a small one. And I was making a transaction. We had all the paperwork on the counter, and the manager jumped up and ran over and yelled, "Get out of the building!" So we just left the money and everything lay right there, and everybody ran out of the building, which would have been tremendous time to go back in and get the money. But we stood outside the building, just kind of holding hands and praying, and the first minute or two, I just didn't think too much of it, but then when it started lasting more than 2 minutes, it really crossed my mind that I was sure this was the end of the world, that we were going to have to live with this for the rest of our lives, and man would have to build new types of buildings and to cope with this situation. I could just see a force within the earth that had created this and that just wasn't going to stop. But the most significant thing that I had to put up with is a week in the Air National Guard on active duty. So I didn't lose my home or anything, but that wasn't fun either.
Nothing very exciting happened to me because I was in the dorm too, and except for a few broken bottles and flying books, it was pretty safe as any place in town. But my father was called out to the base of the command post Friday night to meet this McDermott that came from the White House. And he was in contact with the command post in Washington. And the newspapers there said that Anchorage had been leveled and that there were over 800 dead here. And the headline, it had a great big picture of 4th Avenue. And of course, from the picture, all you could see was just the ground, and it looked like everything was laying on the ground. And the headline across the front of the page was "Our Town," that they got from the banner that went across the street. And he said that Friday, he flew out to Scott to a commander's conference Saturday night. And so Friday, when he went to get his ticket at International, he said that almost all the planes were empty because if people were coming or going, they'd already been there or left here. And so most of the planes weren't filled up. But after the tremor that we had on Friday, by 3 o'clock, every single airline out at International had sold out, and there were people waiting in line for cancellations or for people who couldn't go at the last minute.
After some of the stories I've heard, some of them are really fantastic too. I feel I was pretty lucky. I was out at Hilbert too, up on the slope, and I was about 3/4 of the way down when I heard a roar, and I thought it might be a jet coming over because it's right at the end of the runway, and they usually come over the top of the hill. So I looked toward the top of the hill, and there were no jets. Then I thought, well, the military's firing again. They're firing pretty close because the ground started shaking. And then the ground really started shaking, and it was an earthquake then. And I looked behind me, and the rope tow was just really rocking back in back of me, and the thing had stopped already. And so I moved away from that, and I was still on my skis, but I was doing all kind of crazy dances on the side of the slope. And about the only thing I could do was just stand there. And I thought about which way the waves had come. I don't think they were south. They were going across the slope. If they'd have been coming down the slope, I'd probably been down the foot of the slope a few seconds later. And that's the only thing I can think about. But the ground beneath me it sounded like it was going to open up any minute. The cracking and the groaning of the earth, and the snow, and when we got down to the bottom of the hill, big crack, just let my nerves just shambles. But I think the interesting thing was that when we got back down to the bottom, some people had radios, and what shook most people up around there were some of the fantastic stories, like people have said about these rumors. It's really bad because you hear rumors about 300 people dead. That's the first thing I heard, 300 people dead in Anchorage. And Penny's building had collapsed, and 4th Avenue didn't exist anymore. And so it's really got everybody shook up, especially I wasn't able to get back home immediately. And this really has people worried, I was really surprised at the fantastic rumors that went around, tremendous tidal waves and all this other mess. And that's one thing I learned, about this whole thing is that these rumors that get started this way, I don't know who starts them, but it has some fantastic stories. Another thing I think people would be interested in is that a few of the science students around the school here are going to do a little bit of study on some of the clay that Anchorage is built on. It seems that we have a nice little type of clay that runs fluid. It turns to liquid down here. And they think it's due to a mud flow that underlies part of the bluffs out at Turnagain. And So maybe we can do something else more interesting and maybe learn a little bit more about this earthquake business. And also, all these reports, nobody knows anything about the earthquake so far, the geologists. I've heard 4 or 5 reports about the epicenter of the earthquake, and one place is 75 miles east of Anchorage, which would be on land, and some people say it's 150 miles southwest of Anchorage, southeast of Anchorage, which is place in the water. So we're going to try to do some studies on it.
Well, Friday afternoon about 5:30, my mother, brother, and I were sitting in our kitchen at the dining table having some coffee and sweet rolls. We don't usually have coffee and sweet rolls, and something always comes along to mess up a good thing, you know. We were sitting there, and the house started shaking. We live on a cement block house that, well, it's a cement slab. The whole house is just put together in one piece, so that the whole house started to shake like this, and we started to shake. And we're earthquake veterans, having lived in Japan, so we immediately jumped straight up, and I thought I didn't think it was going to last very long, so I just stood there rocking back and forth, waiting for it. But my mother, almost had to twist us by the ears to get us out of the house. She started screaming, "Let's get out of here!" you know. And so she opened the back door and started running out, and she just went and just jumped into the snow and buried herself out there. And so we followed close behind, so close we were tripping over each other, and we ran outside, and we couldn't stand up. We live over in City View and on sort of a bluff, and we just absolutely couldn't stand up, so we fell on our hands and knees. And about that time, I couldn't think of anything. You know, people say that things keep running through your mind, but nothing was running through my mind. I couldn't think of a thing except that since we do live on a hill, I thought that it was going to slide any minute. And our telephone pole was going back and forth, and the wires were going back and forth, and I didn't, and the earth was going up and down, and I didn't know if we were going to slide down the hill, and I didn't know if it was going to last very long or not. And as soon as I could, I ran over to the chemistry, after it was over, I ran over to AMU to get my chemistry crystals so I could take care of those. I heard that the chemistry department had a big fire and everything like that, and I wanted to get my crystals, and so I ran over to preserve my chemistry crystals.
Well, I was on duty out at Elmendorf at the time this all started. I'd been working on some reports in my section and had gone next door to collect some figures. And as I started back, this whole affair started. And I moved out to the middle of our parking lot and saw the chimneys on the 2 buildings, and the one on mine came through the roof. And after the earthquake, I found it landed on my desk. So I think the fantastic thing about this was seeing the military go into action. I think the people out at Fort Richardson needs a word of thanks, because they were the first, well, maybe not the first, but they came in to the city of Anchorage, and the National Guard boys, they did a fantastic job preserving order here in town when the police force just wasn't adequate. They didn't have enough men to go around to all that needed to be done. And being on base out here, seeing the people come in from down south, and seeing the action, I think this is something we don't want to see again, but being able to see what can be done in an emergency is something.
Well, John fairly well covered my situation. I will say that my reaction was just one of utter confusion. I saw these dishes flying and everything else, and I just couldn't figure out what was happening. I thought of a bombing, but no, it couldn't be. And then that chandelier started going back and forth, and we decided to get out of there. And I really thought it was pretty funny. I felt bad afterwards. And I hated to go home because I saw Jerry's house and I wanted to help him clean it up. But I will say that was one of the longest rides home. I thought I'd never get there. The cars were just bumper to bumper, and we saw these big cracks in the highway, and I thought, oh no. And they seemed to be getting bigger as we got closer to home. And I was sure relieved when I saw my home standing in one piece, and there was very little damage. I was really amazed. I wanted to go back and help Jerry clean up his, because my dad had cleaned our mess up. And my dad and my little brother were home, and my mother was coming home from work. She was out on Fort Richardson, and she had taken a friend to the commissary, and she was waiting outside. She wasn't military. And she said she had just turned the car on to listen to the radio, and she thought, what is wrong with this car? It's this, she says, this motor, and we're going to have to take it into the shop again, you know? And she said, she really thought it was a good place to be. She says it's just rocking and everything, and kind of a fun joyride, except this camper right next to her. She said it was pretty top-heavy, and it was going too, and she thought it might plop over on her. And we all came home, gathered home within about a half an hour, and except for my one brother, he had been doing his paper out. My mother was just worried sick. She didn't know where he was, and the radio kept saying, don't go out on the roads, don't go look for anyone, just stay home, and everybody get home. So my dad wouldn't let her go look for him, but he has the hospital, Providence Hospital, on his route, and he was right in front of the hospital when it happened. And so he was recruited to help them clean up and carry patients upstairs and everything else as just a helper. But we really suffered very little damage.
Well, this earthquake was a real experience for me. I'm from Idaho, and when I first came to Alaska, I thought just a little earthquake would be fine. And this one was really something. I live in the apartment house across from the Westwood Hotel, and I was there at the time, and Jim had stopped in on his way home from work, and we were sitting there talking, and the thing started to shake, and so we sat on the floor, and the corner cupboard fell over, and all the dishes fell on the floor, and 3 windows broke out of the place. And by that time, I was really getting scared, and it wouldn't stop. And so we had to get out somehow, and we made it to the door, and all the books, we have a bookshelf by the door, and all the books were on the floor, and we went out to the stairway, and down 3 flights of stairs, and we just held on to the side banister trying to get down. And we went there and stood in the parking lot behind our apartment house and saw the Westwood Hotel just going back and forth, and the scaffold on the side I thought was going to go for sure. And all the cars in the parking lot were going back and forth too. And finally it stopped, and being adventuresome, I guess we went on, and I didn't have any shoes on. Anyway, I went upstairs and got some shoes, and we went downtown. And we walked down to 4th Avenue, and it was really a mess. You just couldn't believe it. And there's people down there in cars in the hole, and they were sitting lopsided, and the street lights were turned over. And then we heard that there was some excitement by pennies. And so we went up there, and they were pulling this lady out of her car. One of the concrete slabs of pennies had fallen on top of her car, and they had torches and 3 wreckers trying to get her out. And so we stood there for a while watching them pull her out. And then we walked over to the post office trying to get a telegram out to my folks in Idaho so they wouldn't worry. But there was no communications at all. And anyway, they were ordering the downtown area evacuated, and so we went back to the apartment, and my aunt was there then. She was at the store getting groceries, and so piled in the car, and I don't know what we did. We just drove around for a while trying to get out of town, and then we went out to Eagle River. We have a cabin out there. It was a very exciting time. But can I tell them this? One of my friends lives on the 14th floor of the 1200L building, and I went up there to try to help her get some of her mess cleaned up, and you couldn't believe it. It had broken a frame around a picture, and a hardback chair, the back had just split right up the side, and the rug was twisted in knots, and the whole floor was just covered with all the plaster fell off the walls, the bookshelves fell over, and the TV was laying on the floor in a hi-fi. And I don't see how she got down those 14 flights of stairs. It was terrible.
Well, I just walked into Cole's Cleaners, and I'd just gotten up to the counter, and the woman who was giving out the cleaning was an elderly lady, and she says, we're having an earthquake. And my little sister was with me. She's 10, and it began to shake pretty rough, and we started for the door, and she said, no, don't go out, the wires will hit you. So we went back by the counter, and my little sister says, let's go out. And so we spent a few minutes going back and forth from the door to the counter. When finally, the last time we went up by the door, we were standing there, and I happened to think about the window, so I moved back a little bit, and a cigarette machine, it just looked like it just kind of waddled across the floor and just tipped over right in front of the door. So we decided, well, we'll just stay in. And another woman outside in the parking lot was in the same situation. She'd just gotten out of her car, And she was sort of going back and forth from the building to her door, and she couldn't stand up, and all of the cars out in front had stopped, and they were just rocking really hard. So after it was over, I asked a lady for my cleaning. she said, well, the electricity's off, so I can't get it for you. Go back and get it yourself. So we walked back through the back, and things were knocked over everywhere. I couldn't figure out how they had the cleaning stacked, so I just said, I'll come back Saturday. And we went home. My little brother is 9, and he was home alone, and he'd ran outside, and he'd ran next door, and the dog was running all around, and the house was a mess, and I decided to do a really smart thing, and I drove downtown, and it was quite a mess. My mother works in the Westward Hotel Beauty Salon, and we got up to the door, and the doors were all jammed, and everything was in the middle of the floor, the shampoo and rollers and everything. So we decided that we'd go back home, and it took us, maybe a half an hour to get back out of home, and my mother still wasn't there, so we just waited, and I was still really in bewilderment, and after seeing the Hofbrau up on a little lump and the front of Penny's down on the sidewalk, I just, how about that? Afterwards, of course, I knew the extent of the damage, and I was, the second one we had, I was a little more, I was out in the car before the thing ended, and it was only 30 seconds, so from now on, I'm a little more jumpy.
My reaction wasn't just, how about that, because I was inside Penny's. I was in the dressing rooms at the time trying on some clothes. The dressing rooms are on the second floor, and they're right in the front of the building, the wall that fell. Well, I had just taken off everything I had on practically, and had just stepped into an evening dress, and hadn't had it quite zipped. And things started shaking, and I had been through several earthquakes before in Okinawa, Japan, California. So I didn't think too much of it at first, until the ceiling started coming down, the floor started going through, and the walls started falling out. And I was on the floor at this time, and the mirrors all in the dressing rooms were down on the floor, and I was barefooted, but I didn't think of anything, my clothes, my parka, purse, nothing. I tried to get out of the dressing area. I was stepping over rubble and wood and broken glass, everything was all over the place. But I didn't feel anything except that I had to get out, and I couldn't quite see too well because the lights had gone off by this time. I didn't see anybody else. By the time I got out of the dressing area and onto the main part of the floor, everyone else had left. But I did hear someone else yelling from the stairway, "Get out of the building, get out of the building." Well, it took a while to get to the stairs, to get out of the building, because I was on the opposite side of the store from the stairway. But I hung on to a dress rack. I don't know how I thought that would help for a while. It was something to hold on to, though. At least I was able to stand up. And as I was holding on, I saw the huge pillars similar to the little one in the room, but they were much larger, that go through the 5 floors. And at the base of it, it just started to crumble. It just fell into little bits, and by this time the dress rack, I didn't think it was going to help me too much. I headed for the stairway and past the escalator, and that wasn't working. I don't know why I decided not to run down there, but just because it wasn't working, I guess, I decided to take the stairway. Well, mannequins were all over the floor, and the first thing I thought were bodies, but no, they weren't bodies. I felt that Anchorage was leveled without any news. But I finally got out the back, and then I realized my purse. And I had my car sitting right there out in the parking lot, and everyone else was backing out and getting out of there because they said the building was going to fall down. The front had already gone. The back they said, was going to come down. And I couldn't move, so I just sat in my car for warmth for a while because I was practically in nothing. Just stocking feet, no shoes, nothing. And then I realized, well, I'm not going to stay here. I'd rather have the car crushed, but not stay here. So I left and went across the little church building behind. And people were rather hysterical, the other employees. I knew quite well because I worked at Penny's also. And they had lit cigarettes and were smoking. And then the pastor of the church said, "Please don't light your cigarettes. The gas main's broken." Everybody ran out of that building. It was cold. The street was better than either building. Then by that time, the police were around, ambulances, and people had already helped, pitched in. They were directing traffic and helping and looking for people who had come to get them. I didn't know what had happened, where my home, whether it had gone down or not. I was looking for my father. But I got home several hours later. The personnel manager of employees helped me get home. We helped also at home for the next 2 or 3 days quite a bit because my father's a ham. He has a mobile rig in the car, and stationed in the basement. So for a couple of days I played private secretary, and every 2 minutes the phone would ring. And, yes, ma'am, may I help you? Who do you want to send the message to? What is your name? How would you like it signed? What's the address? Do they have a phone number? This went on we sent out hundreds of messages for people, and then later, after a couple of days, we were taking in messages that were coming in. The people were frantic on the other end. They thought that Anchorage was really down and wanted to know about the people up here. We were glad to help, but it was quite an experience. My mom was in the shower at the time, and that was something for her. She thought the kids in the next room were really hooping it up. Our home itself was quite untouched. So after it was all over, I found that I was almost relieved, because from what I was feeling at the time of the earthquake, nothing really was too bad. But I thought that Anchorage had really gone.
Well, I was just starting to put my guitar away in the case, and everything started falling around. And I didn't reach for anything because I didn't think it would do much good. I only had 2 hands. Well, and one was around the guitar. And the coffee was spilled all over the floor, and it certainly gives you a weak feeling because there's nothing you can do. You just have to ride it out. We used to live on Marston Drive, and that doesn't exist anymore. So that was a lucky move we made.
Well, when this all started, I was in the Safeway parking lot on 9th and Gamble. And I didn't know exactly what had happened because the car started moving, and I just stopped and the engine was running, and I thought, well, this car's had it. It's out of gear and it's still moving and all this. And so it starts moving from left to right, and I'm holding on to the steering wheel, and every time it goes this way, the steering wheel goes this way, and it's about to throw me off right out of the car. So there's this car sitting in front of me, and I start moving towards this, and it's still not in gear, and I can't figure out what's going on. So the engine's running, I put it in gear and start to back up, and I just get it backed up. Started about ready to shut the engine off, I'm sitting right on top of this car again. So I still couldn't figure out what was going on, there's nothing running through my brain. I look down, and the parking lot's kind of going like this, and look up, and there's a telephone pole going this way. So I figured, well, we must be having an earthquake or something here. And about that time, I looked at this kid next door, and he's rolling around on the seat. He's having a ball, Some kind of nut. Well, I was laughing at the time, and I didn't, I felt kind of ashamed because these people were bouncing off the cars. These 2 cars on each side were rolling back into other people. Well, by that time, my mom came back from Safeway. She didn't ever make it inside. She thought she was going crazy. Her pocketbook's all torn up, and she's shaking and all this, and I'm getting inside, and I'm laughing. She's about ready to kill me or something. So we start down 6th Avenue, and by the time we get to Penny's, we see the street is kind of filled up with a penny store. It's a big crack in the back of the store. I begin to cool off a little bit then, it's not so funny now. By the time we get to our apartment, I didn't think it was funny at all because it kind of fell in. The street in front dropped, and my neighbor, he just came around the corner in this big truck. He comes around the corner, it's icy, and the street kind of moves out of the way, and he goes right over the bank. So he's kind of shook up after that, but we got away without any damage at all.
Well, we were just about ready to eat when the earthquake hit, and my mom had everything in the stove, and when the earthquake started, my mom, she got sort of excited, she started praying and everything. She usually doesn't pray, and so all our food started to fall out on the floor and everything. The house started shaking, and the boards were creaking, and my mom grabbed a hold of the wall and just stood there, and I didn't think it was anything too exciting until the news reports started coming in. The radio went off, and all our lights were off, and I realized that something serious must have happened.
Well, when the earthquake started, I was upstairs in my room reading, laying on my bed. And I've been through a few before, so I figured, well, it's just an earthquake. It'll go away in just a second. But then it kept getting worse and worse. And so I jumped up off my bed, and I went running down the stairs. And at the bottom of the stairs, you have to make a right turn to go out the front door. And there's a little hallway, and the door opens. And there's a kind of little triangle in there where the door opens, and you can't get out if you get stuck in there. And my little brother reached for the door at the same time I did. And I'm a little bigger than he is, so he got knocked up behind the door. And the door got open, and he was running around in there trying to get out while everybody else was going out the door, and he was stuck, and he couldn't get out. That's about all that happened.
I imagine my experience was a little different than the rest of you. I was walking across the street to the market basket, and from there I was going over to Penny's store.
And as I started to walk across the street, I noticed that I was having a little trouble walking, and I thought it was me, not anything else. And of course, I looked up the street, and there was cars coming. I was jaywalking, and I realized all of a sudden that I couldn't stand up. And by this time, there was a few parked cars, and they were starting to sway, and then I began to get the idea it wasn't just me. And as I crossed the street, of course, my first concern was to get across, but my father happened to be in the market basket, and about this time, as I got halfway across, the windows started coming out of the market basket, and my first thought was to go over there and see if everybody could get out, particularly my father. Well, they managed to get out, except my father was very nonchalant about this. He was standing up holding the door because these women were climbing over canned goods and everything else trying to get out. And so I yelled at him, and about this time, the last window in the store broke right behind him. So he stepped out and grabbed onto a man, which was grabbed on his wife, and they grabbed on the car, and it was swaying back and forth. And like I say, I couldn't stand up, and I was down on my hands and knees. And I looked around, and everybody in the office building from across the way was out in the street. And I could see the Hill building. It looked like it came right out over the 6th Avenue there. And I thought for sure that westward was going to fall because you could see it sway. It probably swayed 100 feet from side to side. And of course, the top crane was on the one side that started to topple. The first one went down. And then we got that final burst, that last surge, and it looked like the westward straightened right up. I'm sure if it would have lasted at the same intensity, westward would have gone. That's about it.
Well, what happened to me wasn't very exciting. I was over in the main lounge playing cards, sitting by the big picture window. And when it first started, I thought, oh, big deal, earthquake, and because I'd been in several when we lived down on the chain. But when I went to put my cards on the table, and the table suddenly moved away from me, I decided I better get away from the picture window because it was bowing just like a piece of paper flapping in the wind. And so we got over against the brick wall, and I turned around, looked up just in time to see the lamp coming at me, and I grabbed it before it hit the floor. And we stood there against the wall, and plaster was coming down around us. And we stayed there until the ground settled down, and then I went upstairs to my room to see what was broken. That's all that happened to me.
The earthquake hit during our vacation. I was home at Valdez. We had just sat down to eat dinner, and ground started heaving, and our house started rocking, and thought, oh, an earthquake. We've had them before, and we'll probably have them again, but this one didn't stop. It just kind of kept on, and it still didn't frighten me at all. My little brothers and sisters got rather scared. Finally, I decided, well, this is an earthquake, and it's not a very mild one, so I better go turn off all the lights in the house so there won't start a fire. And I went through the house. Didn't quite make it a couple times. I almost fell flat on my face. I can't really say why, but I think the floor almost came up and met me. But I got half the lights turned off, and then I came back to the kitchen, and my dad was outside, and he yelled for me to come out. I went out, and I had a hard time opening the door, mainly because the house shifted a little, and the front door sticks on one corner now. But I went out in the street, and I looked down the street, and I can see the bay from our house, and I saw the masses of the ship that was in town, and then I heard it whistle 3 times, and the ship was already moving, and I thought, that ship's not supposed to leave now. But I didn't think too much of it, and I looked up the street, and I saw a crack open up in the street and water gush up, but it wasn't a very big crack, so it still didn't bother me. About an hour later, I found out that both the docks in Valdez had gone, and the waterfront was changed. It's up in Mary Wells's front yard right now. Then later on, the fires broke out, and the Union oil is still burning from that.
Well, at the time of the earthquake, I was working on my car, and I was in the garage. It started to shake, so I figured I better get out. And it was a block garage, and the blocks were just kind of like they were swapping places. we started to run toward the door, and the door flew up, and we ran out. And when we stood there, I thought the world was coming to an end. And I was hanging on to a friend that was helping me, and we didn't know what was happening. So after it quit, well, we went down near Penny's. We figured, well, all the 14-story buildings would be down and everything. So we went down to Penny's, and everybody was running around down there. As you all know, the sides all fell off Penny's. And there was a woman trapped in a car right in the corner. And the car was only, I'd say, 3 feet high. And there's big cement slabs on top of it. And we talked to the lady that was in it, and meanwhile wreckers were coming and everything. And we got a cutting torch out and cut the car halfway apart, and got wreckers hooked onto the steering column and pulled the doors open and pulled everything apart. And we got the lady out of the car. She was alive. And everybody, it was funny to watch everybody around there. Everybody was trying to run the whole show. I don't know, it's funny like that, I guess, in a disaster or something. Everybody tries to make like they're calm and they're going to run the whole show. I got quite a kick out of it, even though it was a disaster. It's just, I don't know, it's funny how people acted during that. So after we left there, I wanted to go home and see what happened at home. And I live on L Street, and got over by K Street, and we're just driving along, and here's this big hole about 20 feet down. We couldn't figure it out, because figured buildings would fall down, but the ground is supposed to be solid. So we walked over to my house, and there's big cracks running all over the house and everything, but everything's still standing. And it was, I don't know, the main thing that was so funny about the earthquake, I thought, was the way the people acted when we were trying to get this lady out of this car. It was just everybody was trying to be the boss and to run the whole show. It was just real ironic, I thought.
Well, I was feeding my baby when the earthquake began, and her high chair is right next to the window, so I could see out the window. I just sort of held onto the high chair and watched the evergreens across the way. And it was quite a lot like a number of hurricanes I've experienced. I live on the east coast of the United States, usually, except when I'm in Alaska. And I wasn't dressed, so we didn't leave the house. And after the hurricane was over, earthquake. I turned off my heat and went to see if anybody else had electricity, and I couldn't find anybody who did. And I gathered with a group of friends just sort of by chance at a nearby house, and we stayed there and listened to the radio most of the evening. And so little had happened to me, nothing fell down even in my trailer at all, that nothing seemed very real. Even two friends came in that had been on the 13th floor of the L Street apartments. They were sort of shaken up. And another family came in whose house fell 17 feet, and it just didn't seem very real to me at all. And so that evening, we just listened to the radio and went to bed. It was sort of chilly. And I don't know, I guess in sleep everything went away. And several of the fellows that had been there were on the Alaska rescue team, so they had gone out to help hunt through the houses in Turnagain to see if there was anyone there. And late that night they got back, and I woke to hear them all talking about the horrible condition of the houses. And it just seemed like a terrible nightmare, and it still wasn't real, and it still isn't real now, I don't think.
Well, my father and I run a mail route service to Valdez, Alaska, and I was taking it, being it was Easter vacation. I had been driving the truck for him, so he could have a little rest, and I was just about 20 miles out of Valdez when it all occurred, and I had just hit a patch of ice, and it was very
The grader had scare fired it, and there's little grooves, as you know, depressions to aid the traction of the truck so you don't slip off the road. It was started weaving back and forth, and I thought that this was because of this, that the truck was weaving. And then I thought maybe possibly the rear end might be falling out of the truck because it was really shaky. I looked out the window, and the trees were just going like crazy. And I said, terrible wind this time of year. At any rate, I kept driving. It pretty well stopped. I got rather nauseous, so I pulled the truck up to a halt and hopped out and walked around a little bit, and the truck kept squeaking, you know. I couldn't feel anything because I was so dizzy. So I said, gee, I've been in a little earthquake, looks like, you know. And so I drove down the road a little bit, and there was a terrible crack in the road. And my first impression was I must have been right at the very epicenter. I can hardly wait to get back to college. I'll tell all fellow students how horrified I was. It was a very small crack, though. I was really survived, but the water flushed out of it. Oh, I was just excited. So I kept going down the road, and I ran into a slide. It was pretty large. There was quite a few rocks in it. It was impassable, naturally. So I turned around and went back to the nearest road camp, and there they had everyone was walking around as if they were in a daze. There was very few people there, being it was Good Friday, and it was rather deserted. But things were just a shambles. Inside the house, I knocked on the door, and I said, there's a slide down the road. Could you clear the road for me? I'm rather in a hurry. There was a dance in Valdez. I said I was very rushed to get there, you know. And they walked around like they didn't know where they were. And the radios were on the floor, the shortwave units, and I helped repair them. There's wires dangling all over. We plugged them in where it was handy. And it worked fairly well. And the people that were there, the men, they got in their rigs right away and took off to help clear the road. We got some reports that it was rather bad up the road. The road was tore up very bad. And I stayed there and ran the shortwave radio for 8 hours before they had the road cleared. Then I took the mail into Valdez and stayed at the scale house all night, waiting for the water to go down.
It looks like Friday was probably a day for working on cars. I was in my garage working on a pickup and was waxing it. And the garage started to shake a little bit, and the oxygen was settling and tipped over, so I decided it was time to leave. I walked outside, and we have a water tower in Palmer. It's about 90 feet high, and it was sloshing water out of it. I got the idea there was an earthquake. I shut the pumps off, and we have gas and a diesel pump, and it was shaking even worse. And it subsided, and there was a window broke out down in our other garage, and a few minor things, people out in the streets. And this one old guy he's a town drunk, who was driving up the street, and his car started jerking like that, and he looked down at it, and finally he got out and he walked in the bar. He came out about 5 minutes later, so I figured everything was broken there. And I hooked a generator unit up to the police station and ran the radio there all night. And I noticed the most interesting parallel between police radio, which you would assume to be a fairly factual report of a given situation, compared with KNI or Hart or the rest of the radio stations. And police radio, like we got the report when the 2 people were killed in the sewer, that they were just standing on the pier when the tidal wave come in, and the policeman said, well, there's 2 people on the pier, but they're not there anymore. It was that quick. And the commercial radio stations sheltered everybody. They and such exaggerated truths, and then when they'd give the reports from outside, they wouldn't tell you that this was a report from outside. It was just like they were giving a report, and it wouldn't interrupt it in any way. And I know people in Palmer were panicky because for 35 minutes or 40 minutes there was no radio at all in Anchorage, and you can imagine Palmer sits on all rock that we weren't shaken bad at all. Well, we had the same Richter scale was the same, but we imagined how Anchorage would be, and the slide came down and everything, but you can't really tell. And then when the radio did come, it's a shame that it isn't more factual. That's probably the most unique thing about it all. I learned not to believe the radio much anymore. I know you were an announcer on it, but
I was in the dormitory too. I was just finished curling my hair, so I was standing in front of the mirror taking the curlers out. And all of a sudden the building started shaking, so I grabbed hold of the mirror to hold everything in. So I just stood there, I thought, gee, we're having an earthquake. I've never been in one, so I just sort of stood there and watched everything. So I looked out the window and the trees were moving and the cars were going like this, and I saw a couple of professors walk out and shake their hands and scream and run back here and then run back out. So then I heard everyone running around in the dormitory and everybody said, outside, outside. So I grabbed my coat and ran outside too and just sort of stood and watched a little while until it quit. So then I went back into the dormitory and all my records had fallen down to the floor and my books had fallen on top of that and papers all over the place. And I noticed that I have my record player sitting on a couple of cinder block bricks that are standing straight up. And I noticed this had fallen down and a bottle of bubble bath had spilled all over the back of it. So I grabbed the towel and cleaned it up and started picking up books and talked to everybody else about what they had spilled or broken, and that was it.
Well, when the earthquake went off when I was at home, I was in bed listening to a new album which my brother just bought me for my birthday. It was the Beatles, and the wall started shaking. I had it on pretty loud. I said, man, what a combo. I didn't really turn on. But all of a sudden my radio fell off, my alarm clock, and here I am, what shall I do, So I just stayed in my room, and I leaned up against my chest of drawers because all the drawers were coming out. I held my hand against the mirror, and I had my foot on the bed, holding against the wall. I was looking out the window, here's my car going like this, right next to another car. I had my front end smashed in, I just had it fixed. It's getting closer and closer. I said, oh, please, don't hit, I don't want to hit. That's just about the way it went off. My room was the only one that wasn't hit too bad. And then later on, we cleaned up the house. It was a mess. My skis were all over the place, and we lost about half our china and all our crystal, except for a couple of glasses, sitting there and watching it. And, the only disaster I could figure out, you hear it on the radio about a half hour later when it came back on. Big disaster downtown. There was this small crack right across the street. And I said, man, it's been a bad earthquake. Take a look down at that thing. And the only disaster I could figure out, there was no lights, no heat. But it was on a Friday night, man. I was going to go out. I had no place to go. That was the worst part of the whole earthquake for me.
Well, I was driving a 5-yard dump truck with about close to 7 yards of dirt on it, a little bit overloaded. And I didn't notice the earthquake until gravel stuff started coming over the cab of the truck. And it's a pretty old truck, and I thought something went somewhere, so I jumped out. And I stood on the side of the road and watched it unload about 3 yards of dirt. And I didn't find out what had happened until later on that night. I went back into town.
Nothing very exciting happened to me. I was up in my room. Things started shaking around. There was a buddy up there with me. We thought it was just another earthquake. Pretty soon it got a little more violent, so we said we better get out of the dorm here. Tried running. We got sort of thrown from one wall to the other a little bit. Ran down the stairs and went out and watched the trees and cars jump around. Then after it was over, we went up to the room and saw everything was a mess. We said we was going to go downtown and see if we could see a busted window or two, or maybe a crack in the road or something. Got down there, and we got down on the 15th, and we saw a fireplace, and we thought, well, we'd really seen something, And we drove downtown a little further, and then we got stopped because we couldn't get down on 4th Avenue, so we walked up and down there, and we saw most of the stuff that happened. And we was down on the 3rd, and there was this one car that had been driving along, and the pavement opened up, and he dropped the wheel down in there. So we helped the guy get his car out of there. That was about all that happened, except we did get to see quite a bit of the people running around. The disaster right at the be on hand at one time there. Something you never get to see, really.
I think I know now why we have earthquakes, just so that we can give speeches in speech classes. Well, I would like to say that I was in a car with a student in this class, Beverly James, and we were on our way to my house to get some clothes so that I might spend the night with her. And we were about a block from our house when it hit, and I didn't know what it was. I'd experienced them standing up, but never in a car. The wheels sort of give with the road, and I knew the car was stopped, but I kept screaming at her, will you please stop the car? We've got a flat tire. And I kept screaming this, and I knew the car was stopped. And I watched people. There was a child
who had jumped out of a car, and he was trying to run away, and the father was trying to get him, and it was really pathetic because the father kept falling and he couldn't catch his child. And finally, Beverly turned around and gave me a very disgusted look and said, "It's an earthquake." I consider myself quite calm, and I thought that she was quite hysterical, but it really turned out to be the opposite. After we finished, we went to my house, and I crawled over the junk on the floor, and I went to my room, and I had to force the door open because the piano had moved against the door, had completely come across my room and moved against the door. And I got inside, and I got my bath powder and my clothes, and I put them all in a little suitcase and started out the door, and my daddy screamed at me and asked me where I was going, and I said I was going to spend the night with Beverly. And he wouldn't let me go, and I thought he was terrible because of this. So Beverly left the house, and we were there to pick up the debris lying all over the floor. And nothing really ever bothered me. I never knew what was really happening. And I was completely, I just didn't know. I was blinded. It was like it never happened. And then my boyfriend came over to our house to live with us because he'd left the barracks because they wouldn't let them back in. And now I really feel lucky that we've all come out of this alive. And my mother had made this comment, "I don't care what's happened to the house, but we're alive." And I kind of laughed sarcastically, and then I heard all of the details that had happened, and now I'm just beginning to wonder about the employment.
I suppose mine will be repetitious, but I can tell you some of Loie's reactions. And believe me, she's not calm at all. We were driving along, we just left Doug, which is her boyfriend, and we were driving along in the car, and all of a sudden, it felt like a Bronco. And I said, "My goodness," or Loie said, "My goodness," I don't remember which, "we must have a flat tire." And I said, "Yes, evidently so." And so I was trying to stop the car, and it was already stopped and just bouncing around all over the place. And then I looked up ahead, and there was a man who'd been driving right ahead of us. And his car was going in the same direction, and doing the same little gyrations as mine. So I figured, well, it's not a flat tire, so it must be an earthquake. And about this time, Loie's in my lap, and I'm sitting here trying to calm her down. She kept on saying, "You're going to open up," and then that started me wondering. I said, "No, I don't think so. It's just an earthquake. I've lived in Alaska for 12 years. I know what's going on." So we got to her house, and like she said, we were quite irate at her family because they wouldn't let her go. It was no big thing. So I started driving down Government Hill, and I got down there at the end of the railroad tracks, and I'd been on the hill for about 20 minutes because cars were lined up, just hundreds of them, clear back up the hill. And I got down there, and here's this great big old crack, right down there by the railroad track. And it was about a foot wide, and one side was right about here, and then about a foot down was the other side. And you should have seen the little sports cars going across it. It was really something. And then I got past that finally, and I got up to right at the bottom of C Street, and we couldn't even go completely through up to even at the bottom of the hill. And I saw the hill, it was just erupted all over the place, and all these buildings were toppled, and people were walking. I can remember a lady walking in high heels, and she had rollers in her hair and everything, and she looked kind of upset. And then I had to go through the train yard, and I got on up there, and then it took me 50 minutes to get home. Of course, I was frantic. I knew my mother would be, real worried about me, and I got home, and she wasn't there, so I read a book, and then finally she came in. I was sitting there drinking a Coke and had a candle lit and was reading my book. But I didn't think it was bad until the radio came on.
Well, my experience during the earthquake was much like everyone else's in this room. And the experience that I had after the earthquake, the Saturday morning when we went down and volunteered for volunteered our experiences and our qualifications for anything that they could use us for down at the disaster control area in the public safety building downtown. And the experiences that I had Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, I'll never forget. But this wasn't too bad either compared. Have you all got your typhoid shot? Well, I didn't get mine until yesterday morning. I didn't have time during all the commotion, and it was really bad downtown. So yesterday morning, I walked into the school over here to get my typhoid shot, and evidently I was the first one there this morning, and all the girls were quite happy to see me. And I thought they were a little bit eager when I walked in the door. And this was my first one in a series of 3. I doubt if I'll go back and get the other. But anyway, I walked up to the desk and took off my coat, and I says, this is the first one. This is not a booster. I'll take the first shot. So the lady, I don't know what happened to her that was giving the shot, but after about 5 or 6 times to get it into my arm, it swelled way up afterwards. And I asked her which was the hardest duty, getting the shot or giving it. And she kept trying to put it in my arm and couldn't get it in. And finally I said, well, is there anybody else who would give the shot? And that was the highlight of my experiences in this little earthquake that we had, was getting that shot.
When the earthquake hit, my wife and I had just come back from shopping downtown, and we'd started in the house from the car. When we felt the earthquake, my wife started to go on in the house, and I told her she'd better not, so we grabbed onto some gate posts and held them up during the earthquake. They got pretty heavy at times. Then the first thing I did when we went in the house was to go into my study to see how my term papers had fared. I usually use a bottle of bourbon for a paperweight, and my first thoughts were that I couldn't possibly turn in that religion term paper with bourbon all over it. I figured maybe Dr. Langworthy wouldn't mind, but I was sure Dr. Gay just wouldn't understand. After we killed about a half bottle of gin, we went down to the hospital where my wife works and looked in the lab, and we decided not to clean it up that day. It was kind of bad off. So we did grab some blood out of the blood bank and go out here to Providence, and we spent the rest of the night with her working in the lab and me carrying stretchers.
Harry Walls and I had just completed a badminton game over at API. We were practicing for the tournament, which I don't think will ever be held. And I had offered, since he'd been so nice to me and he was teaching me this game and everything, I said, well, listen, I said, take me over to the drive-in. I said, I'll buy you a hamburger. So we drive over to Tasty Freeze, and we sit down there, and he orders the hamburgers, and all of a sudden the car starts going this way. And Harry turns around and he says, who's on the bumper of my car? I says, there's nobody back there. Then it starts going this way, and he says, there's somebody back there. I says, there's nobody back there. And he says, I'm getting out. I says, yeah, me too. So I pull up the door handle, and I shove the door out, and it comes back. And that's not right. So I shoved it out, and I stuck my foot out, and it closed on my foot. And by that time, I was a little bit shook, and I mean, this doesn't even make any sense. So I shoved the door, and I put my hand up, and put the other foot out, and laid down in the seat, and slid out, and I fell in a mud puddle on top of everything. And I got out, and we stood out there, and it was real strange because there were no 2-story buildings there. It was all flat. And there were 2 other cars in the lot besides us and the telephone poles. And the cars were jumping up and down, and the poles were going back and forth, and we stood there holding on to each other, and it quit. And the lady that was actually in front of us in line for the Tasty Freeze to get her hamburgers, she drove off, just left completely. And we went up to the door, and the lady says, I don't know about your hamburgers, you know, because everything was on the floor. But she still had them on there, so she saved them for us. And I said to Harry, I said, here's the money. I said, you stand here. I said, I'm going to go run to the drugstore. I said, this will be fun because it'll be just things all over every place, you know. I'll have all sorts of things to tell people. So I ran in there, and oh man, that was just complete ecstasy because there was junk piled up all over every place, and bottles, and oh, it was horrible. So I come back out and I say, oh Harry, we got to run in there and look at this. It's really something, you know. So he runs in there, and oh my God, he came back out, and he gave me the sack he'd just gotten, and he says, here's the hamburger. He says, I think we better get back to the dorm and see Kit, you know. So we drive back to the dorm, and man, I ran up there and I told everybody about the broken bottles, and oh, this is really exciting, you know, and we got 5 free hamburgers out of the deal, and that was even better, you know, than everything. And about this time, Ron Thorne comes back, and because of the general area and there not being anything around, I thought, well, there's, you know, no sweat. I mean, nothing happened. And he came back and told us about pennies, and I don't know if he was just in a state of shock or what, but he said that he saw people flying out of pennies and buildings coming down, and by this time I was a little bit upset. So I asked Harry if he'd drive me to town, and we own an apartment house on Hill Street. And we came up the back way up 7th from off K, and we hadn't come down Hill Street, so we didn't even see that. And we drove up 7th, and there was a big hole there, and I thought, oh my God. And I looked off this way to see my apartment house, and it wasn't there. It just wasn't there, and I couldn't believe it, and I thought, uh-oh. And I got up and I walked down the hill, and our apartment house had sunk what looked to me about 800 feet, but the geologist said it dropped about 9. And we walked down in this hole, and it was the strangest thing because the apartment house itself had done nothing. It slowly went down, and my father said he sat there and he couldn't do anything. He was painting, so he plopped the lid on the paint can, was holding on to the paintbrush, and he couldn't get out of the building. And he says he just watched it, and it just kind of struggled its way down and landed. And of course, we don't know what happened to the apartment house. We don't know what to do with it. You know, it just settled. And that was it.
I was going up the tow rope at Hillberg when the earthquake struck. I was almost to the top. The tow rope shakes you around quite a bit, and it took me a while before I noticed anything was happening. I saw the trees shaking back and forth like a bunch of fly rods. I didn't think anything of it, and I heard the snow shifting and making just creaking noises underneath me, and I didn't think anything of it. Then the tow stopped, and that was bad because I didn't want to climb the rest of it up the hill. And with the tow stopped, I felt the earthquake, and so I got off the tow and got my skis parallel to the fall line and sat down. I couldn't stand it all. And it got a bit lonely. There were some more people up the hill, so I climbed the rest of the way up, just 25 feet. And we all sat down and enjoyed the view and the ride. And when it was over, I just skied down the hill. I turned on my car radio. We didn't hear anything. All the stations were off, and so I went home.
Belongs to somebody else. She means her tender songs for somebody else. And even when I've got my arms around her, I know her thoughts are strong for somebody else. And the hands I hold belong to somebody else. If they belong to her, she borrowed them. I'll bet they're not so cold to somebody else. It's tough to be alone on the shelf. Worse to fall in love by yourself, because the one we love belongs to somebody else. The one I love belongs to somebody else. We've got a tearful story. She means her tender songs for somebody else. Very sad, but that's amore. You're so Italian. Even when I have my arms around her, I know her thoughts are strong for somebody else. She didn't even leave a note. Can't read anyway. The hands I hold belong to somebody else. I bet they're not so cold to somebody else. It's tough to be alone on the shelf, and it's worse to be loved by yourself. Yeah, the one we love belongs. The one we love keeps singing a song to somebody else.
Almost over. I don't know what to do. Can't give you a Thunderbird or a penthouse with a view. Can't even buy a little present. I'm much too broke, I find. But there is one way I may save the day. and I sure hope you don't mind that I can't give you anything but love, baby. That's the only thing I've plenty of, baby. Dream a while, scheme a while, you're sure to find happiness, and I guess all those things you've always pined for. Gee, I like to see you looking swell, baby. Diamond bracelets were worth dozens sell, baby. Till that lucky day, you know darn well, baby, I can't give you anything. I can't give you anything. I can't give you anything but